Well, let's just talk a little bit about these numbers. You look particularly at emerging economies. And what it seems to me, looking at the numbers and looking at why these numbers are on the list, it seems as though economic empowerment in that country, or whatever country, is being ranked very important in terms of how they're going to rank on the list.
Absolutely. The index looks at where it is most attractive to invest in retail worldwide, particularly in developing countries. It looks at three elements. It is the attractiveness of the market. It looks at the saturation of the market, which basically means how many other retailers are there already. And it looks at things like risk. And those three elements come together in an attractiveness index.
I want to talk a little bit about Brazil, because that seems to be top of that list. Reduced political and financial risk, a young population that's spent in apparel and luxury sector. And that is actually quite interesting, because this young population has to be having an income from somewhere. So is it that Brazil's youth are employed, or where are they getting the money from?
In Brazil, particularly, the economy is doing very well. It has a massive manufacturing base. It has a very large growing oil and gas industry as well. So Brazil as an industry is doing very well. It has a growing population with wealth. So the middle class in Brazil is increasing, and people want to spend their money. They want to spend their money not only on, let's say, primary goods like food and clothing, but also then on luxury goods. So when the economy develops further, the luxury segment becomes more important in retail as well.
That's actually quite interesting, because it seems a little bit of a contrast of what's happening in Africa, because one of the things that the IMF and the World Bank have said is, if you look at Africa, you see these GDPs and you see economies growing, but that's not filtering down. So it seems as though in Latin America it seems to be quite different there, because you've got Uruguay, for instance, that's also on the list.
Yeah, but you have to look into the three elements of the matrix, of the index, sorry. It looks at attractiveness of the market, it looks at saturation of the market, and risk. And risk is related to business risk as well as political risk. And there an element comes in where there is a difference between Africa and Latin America in the perception of the investors. And most of the retail investors still come from Europe and the USA, or North America, let's call it that. There is still a perception of associated risk to Africa. Right or wrong? I believe it's wrong. But if you compare Africa with Latin America, then they believe it's less risky to invest in Latin America compared to Africa. The other element as well is that the economies in Latin America, although they are still developing, they have a little bit further developed than most of the economies here in Africa. So Africa has still a bit of a way to go.
Well, let's talk about Botswana. That's on the list. What is Botswana doing right?
Botswana has a lot of stability. That's the main element there. The other element is that the government in Botswana made a conscious decision to develop a retail sector, to open basically the country up for investments in order to diversify the economy away from mining only. So that type of let's say, laying the ground for and allowing the retail companies to come in is very good and helps the economy to stimulate the economy, and also helps to these retail companies to be very successful.
I have to ask you why a country like Kenya is not on there.
Kenya is, if you look at attractiveness is related to basically the population and the wealth of the population, the middle class. Kenya scores high there. There is also an element of risk, business risk and political risk. And of course, if you compare Botswana with Kenya, for example, we've seen some political changes in Kenya in the last couple of years.
So would that risk be the same reason why Nigeria is not on the list?
Nigeria is similarly, for similar reasons, is not on the list. It has a massive population. It has a large retail base already as well. So another element for Nigeria which counts is that it has already invested a lot into retail. So there is a very good retail industry there, which has some signs of what we call saturation. So that means that new retail companies would really look at the landscape and say, listen, what do we have to add to this market in order to be there? If they believe that there is limited chance to be successful from a business perspective, and there is also an associated, let's say, political risk, or in general a risk of security and safety, then it all comes into play.
Do you rate at all other African countries going into Africa? South Africa, for instance, a lot of South African companies are in some of the other African countries. Yeah. Do you rate that as well? Yeah,
we do. And there is, of course, a little bit of discussion why South Africa is not on the list. And South Africa is not on the list basically for very positive reasons, and that is that it is already a very developed retail
But what
market.
I say to you then, because you had said that a retailer wanting to come here would have to be quite specialized, but then we've got Walmart that wanting to come into South Africa?
That is the second part of the answer I wanted to give, and that is that many companies see South Africa as a sort of stepping stone into Africa. So why does Walmart want to invest into South Africa? Because it provides them with an infrastructure to further invest into Africa, and we've seen that already. There are, of course, there is investment in Botswana. We saw Pick and Pay, I believe, earlier in the week, indicating that they wanted to move further into Zimbabwe. So there is a trend that if you established here in South Africa, you've shown to be successful, you've got accustomed to the African, let's say, culture and structure, then you use South Africa as a stepping stone into the continent.
Well, let's talk about countries that seem to be quite promising right now, whether they are on the African continent or not, because they, like we do have some companies on the African continent that are going outside the continent to establish businesses there.
Yeah, as well. So the question is to look into other countries who are potentially successful in Africa, who could be the future on the list. Well, we've seen, if you look at Northern Africa, Tunisia, Morocco, they have dropped from a high ranking on the list to a lower ranking because of political instability. I believe that will change, so they will go higher. Angola is another country which is, or it's just off the list. It was on place 34, so it will definitely move further up as well. I think another country like Ghana is a very interesting one as well, where you see also there is a lot of investment going on into the resource sector, which creates a, let's say, more wealth in the middle class, which increases spending and increases the need for retail stores to be there.
Willem, I can't let you go without asking you this. You talked about the importance of retailers developing local talent and how important that is to be able to establish and grow a business.
That's correct. The retailers in Africa face a number of challenges. One is they need to make sure that they can compete with the traditional retail business, which is the incumbent business. They need to make sure that they get accustomed to the local circumstances and local cultures and values. They need to build their local staff as well, because that staff has an understanding of the market. But also from a cost perspective, if you have to fly everybody in order to develop a market, it becomes very costly as well. You also need to develop a local supply base. If you are in the grocery business, you can't fly in everything from all over the world. You need to develop your local grocery suppliers. So all in all, that means that retail chains who move into certain markets will start to develop those local markets as well. And that's a very nice spin-off effect.
Thank you so much for joining us.